I'm going to just hand it over immediately to Paula Finn, the Associate Director of the Murphy Institute. City University of New York is the home of, physical home of, and political home of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which along with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is convening this meeting today. So Paula, I'm going to hand it straight over to you. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, brothers and sisters. For those of you who are here from out of town, I want to welcome you, some of you from very far out of town. And I'd just like to start by introducing Maria Castaneda, who will be welcoming us and opening this morning. She is the Secretary-Treasurer of 1199 Service Employees International Union, my home union. And when I was here so many years ago, she was the Director of Organizing for the Nurses Division of the union that Martin Luther King Jr. called his favorite union. So with that, I'd like to just bring up Maria Castaneda.
Thank you, Paula. And on behalf of our 420,000 healthcare workers members of our union, I welcome you to New York, and I welcome you to our very important meeting today. As we all said, this is very critical topic towards a just transition, international labor perspective of energy, climate, and economy. We're very happy to have the meeting be hosted here in our penthouse. Our union, 1199, has a proud history of being an internationalist, and we are very happy to see lots of global trade union leaders gathered in this meeting today, and very happy that we were able to remove ourselves from the day-to-day work to be here to really debate the issue of just transition. And I'm happy to see the representative from South Africa, Brazil, India, Korea, Italy, UK, Switzerland, our neighbor Canada, and of course the representative from my homeland, Philippines, Joshua. I would also like to welcome the unions and the representative of the environmental justice movement that are here today: AFSCME, NISNA, Unite Here, RWDSU, UAW, CWA, TWU Local 100, ATU, Local 3 IEB, and the PSC, as well as many of the allies and our movement. I know we all work together to advance climate justice movement here in New York. Having seen our union voted to join TUED because of what we have seen in their previous work and their key contribution to the campaign against the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Pipeline. So I'm very happy that our union is also a member of the TUED. I'm also thankful to the Murphy Institute because with their program on the climate leadership immersion, I was able to use that resource to send all our officers and staff that are really interested in driving climate justice movement in our union. And every opportunity that we can send people, I take that advantage because it's an excellent way of educating and jump-starting our Green Caucus committee in our union. So thank you, Paula. Thank you, Sean, for that opportunity. We all know we have a lot of work to do in really taking control of energy, which is a killing to stabilizing climate chaos. And I really look forward to our discussion because I myself is just learning all these complexities. And I know in our union, being a healthcare workers union, we care about our patients, but if the patient's environment is making them sick, then we need to address the environment that's causing the illness. And when I was I had the opportunity to attend the COP21 in Paris, and first time I heard climate change is the #1 public health threat of the 21st century, and I keep saying, wow. And seeing the health issues that are facing our communities, the diseases that are proliferating, I said, this is really true, what the theory that I heard in 2015. So as a healthcare union, as a healthcare workers, we care about our planet, our environment, and I really look forward to learning more and hopefully really do something concrete to take control of the energy that will help stabilize our climate. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you, Maria. And I want to make note that in this very room, in 2014, 1199 SEIU passed a resolution against the Keystone XL pipeline, and I think at that very same meeting in support of the 2014 People's Climate March here in New York. So we're in a historic location. The focus of this meeting today is just transition, which is being taken up by unions and their allies all over the world. Organized labor, workers, and their allies are presently confronting a climate and environmental crisis that exacts the largest toll on poor and working class communities. Catastrophic storms that wipe out whole neighborhoods, severe droughts causing starvation, environmental dumping, the health implications that Maria referred to, and actual and threatened layoffs. This is the result of a transition process dominated by corporate interests and the governments held in their sway. And it's a transition that since COP1 in 1995 has made little to no real progress. The consumption of coal, oil, and gas has in recent decades grown dramatically. Since the mid-1980s, global coal use has in fact doubled. At this moment, 1,600 coal power plants that are planned or under construction in 62 countries, which together would add 850 gigawatts of new coal generation capacity and a global increase in coal-fired power of 43%. There's also been a dramatic growth of oil use. In August 2016, the IEA reported that oil demand had risen to a little over 97 million barrels per day, up from roughly 76 million barrels per day in 2002. It is therefore the urgent task of organized labor and its allies to take up the revolutionary implications of this crisis that will require systemic change to bring a just transition into being. Our capacity to tackle these tasks must now flow from an honest assessment of where we are as a movement. Personally, here in the United States, we are now at a union density level of around 10%, but we're still in the private sector roughly 6%. The public sector unionization upon which our labor movement has depended for decades now is looking at a huge body blow coming from a Supreme Court decision next month. So we are a weakened labor movement. We're also a divided labor movement. We've got unions that have various approaches to the level of severity of the climate crisis, but also solutions to it. We are divided over whether unmitigated economic growth and extractive capitalism must be challenged, or we can somehow ride the wave of green jobs towards the solution of the climate crisis. So we're small and divided. And one of our goals here today is to hear how unions in different parts of the world are using just transition to organize, educate, and form alliances to build power. You have received an email from Sean. It's a two-ed working paper that I hope you've had the chance to crack open, Unions and Just Transition, the Search for Transformative Politics, which, as Sean will explain in the next panel, makes the case for unions, given the science, to take bold and radical approach, anchored in a clear understanding that extractive capitalism, unmitigated economic growth, and a sustainable planet are incompatible. The title of the meeting suggests that we hope to hear from a range of perspectives throughout the day, with a particular focus on the following: the economic and systemic roots of the ecological challenge, the implications of the science and the need for a zero-carbon world, the critical importance of the struggle for control of energy through the development of a pro-public democratic approach to renewable energy. It was Naomi Klein who addressed the launch of the Canadian union Unifor, which I think is in the room, right? Am I correct? Unifor? Yeah. And she was referring to the moral purpose of trade unionism to be agents of social change. Because of its implications for all of humanity, winning the climate fight will mean victory on so many fronts: equality, control over work, and the end to the violence of poverty. This opening session will begin with Natasha Romanu. And is she here? Yeah. From NASA's Goddard Institute, based at Columbia University. Natasha will provide a summary of the main conclusions of the scientific community dealing with different aspects of climate change. The data streams in constantly, and we thought it important to provide a sense of the most recent findings and what they mean. So let's start with Natasha.
Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to address this audience, and I am happy to discuss some issues that I work on day to day. They are mostly scientific work that we are doing at Columbia University and the NASA Goddard Institute, which is a few blocks up north in Manhattan. So I am an academic by training, a physicist. I have been working on climate models, these big collaborations across different countries to put together the picture of climate change today and in the future, as humans are influencing the climate more and more. We are responsible for putting together the basis, the scientific basis of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change reports, which are issued every few years, every 7 years, based on which the stakeholders, which means politicians and governments around the world, NGOs, etc., are building the case for adaptation and mitigation of climate change, which culminate into the COP meetings every year. So we are, at the same time, I'm involved in grassroots movements here in New York for climate change and just energy transition. I have worked very closely with Sean Sweeney and the Rosa Luxemburg Institute in New York and in Europe, numerous occasions trying to organize scientists and the movements with a focus on what climate change is and how we can prevent it best. So I follow very closely this work, which I think that it is at the center of the at the center of our efforts as activists to change not only the public opinion about what climate change and not only the political moves around it, but also envision a new future for our societies based on just transition, democratic planning, and participation. And I think that unions, in particular trade unions, are critical in this effort because together with the educational system and the media, as well as the movements, of course, they play a key role at bringing the message and educating their members about the issues we are facing, about the consequences, and initiate a dialogue and participation from everybody, inclusive participation, against the unjust, undemocratic, authoritative, and prescribed solutions that we have been listening to towards a low-carbon or carbon-free world. In my mind, the question is not whether we need a transition to a low-carbon or carbon-free world, but how and when we are going to have this transition. And I know that this discussion here for the next, today is going to focus on the how, but I'd like to give you some information about what is happening right now with climate change and some key issues which I want you to keep in mind. Everybody knows what climate change is in this room, right? We are talking about the change in climate, that it is man-made. Climate has been changing over centuries and eons in geological history because of natural variations, whether they are in the sun, in the Earth's orbit, whether they are in the concentration of the chemical and concentration of the Earth's atmosphere. We are not talking about that. We are not talking about natural changes of the Earth system, but we are talking about the man-made changes, which are contributed through fossil fuel emissions like gas, oil, and coal, and also through land use. A big issue in this discussion must be the land use change and how forests, for example, are turned into massive expanses of forests are turned into agricultural land and obviously residential areas. We want to be looking at these transitions, why they're happening, how they can be prevented, or how they can be changed. The consequences of this now emissions and land use change to the ecosystem and the planet as a whole also have been known for a while. You hear them as I said, every 7 years from the State of Climate report from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. But I'd like briefly to recapitulate here. The temperature on Earth is higher than it has ever been in the last 150 years, since we are keeping records. The global average temperature has risen above 1 degree right now compared to the beginning of the century, but in some parts of the world that translates to 6 degrees warming. Much warmer summers, extremely hot, much warmer summers and warmer winters. We have experienced particularly destructive hurricane season. This year was a record. And we are seeing that this record is being broken every summer in the Atlantic tropical zones. We see huge floods occurring. For example, over the last weekend, we saw a 1,000-year record broken twice in easternboard US, in Maryland, for example, and areas around it. We've seen nightmarish wildfires in California, in Portugal, and elsewhere around the world. And we are predicting, climate models are telling us that hurricanes will be more destructive. We will have more floods. We will have more droughts in different parts of the world. We will have much more extreme precipitation in almost a quarter of the land areas of this world. And oceans at the same time, which are a source of oxygen as well as important for the livelihood of millions of people, will acidify, will lose its oxygen, and will warm. Ice melts at unprecedented levels. In the next few decades, in the next couple of decades, we expect that we will have ice-free Arctic summers. That has tremendous consequences for the health of the planet, because that's where the climate is driven from through ice ice ocean albedos and the feedbacks. Rising CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels also affect the quality of the food, which is being deteriorating, and the quality of the soil, which again we are losing control of. At the same time, diseases are now being much easier to spread through more humid and warmer conditions. Food, as I said before, is being affected. Rice, for example, is known to become less nutritious at high temperatures. Species, including humans, but other species more so than humans, are less and less able to cope with this change. And we need to understand that that will lead to even further instabilities of the ecosystems and our life on this planet. We need to limit warming. It is unequivocal. The scientific community has a consensus on that we have to limit warming. And the question is not how much, but how soon we need to limit warming, particularly warming below 1.5 degrees. For many years, people grappled with the limit of 2 degrees just because it was set, is an arbitrary set that was an arbitrary number, threshold that was set in the 90s, when we didn't have a clear picture of the impacts of climate change. But now we see that 1.5 degrees, the change is going to be, after 1.5 degrees warming, the change will be catastrophic. Now remember that that's only 0.5 degrees above today's warming. With a 2-degree limit, we will double the possibility that the water resources will run out in key areas of the world, like, for example, the Mediterranean, Central America, and South Africa. Crop yield will be greatly reduced. Almost 50% less crop will be available, especially for wheat and maize, at the 2-degree level versus the 1.5-degree level. At 1.5-degree level, quarter of the world will be above 1.5-degree level. The quarter of the world will become arid through drought and wildfires. It is clear that there are many emergencies that the global workforce is facing today. Unemployment rates are rising, economic inequality, migration, welfare cuts, austerity. Climate change is an emergency too. We need a new system that is just and equitable, that addresses emissions but also growth and energy use. What kind of growth do we want? What is the energy system that is going to provide us with solutions to the climate emergency? Where we all need to, here it is where we all need to do our own part. Scientists alone cannot change things, educators alone, activists alone, trade unions alone. No, we need everybody together in this effort, because we cannot change just a single sector of the economy, the energy sector, for example. It's the whole society needs to adapt into a carbon-free world, and we need to move to it together. We need to build a global movement to protect those who are disproportionately affected by climate change in the global south, in countries that are hit hard by other problems, but climate change is exacerbating the effects. We need a just transition, not later, now. And we need to change the system by us now.
Thank you, Natasa. I'd now like to introduce Vavi, who is the former General Secretary of COSATU and played a central role in the founding of the new South African Federation of Trade Unions, which formed after a few years after the Marikana massacre, in which it became plain that COSATU, ANC, and the current president of South Africa played a role really detrimental to the striking workers in that massacre. SAFTU was launched on May Day in 2017 and now represents 26 unions and roughly 800,000 workers. It describes itself as an independent force for workers within South Africa, and its founding statement promises, "We shall mobilize workers to oppose Eskom's planned closure of 5 coal-powered power stations, which could produce 30 to 40,000 job losses. Fight the partial privatization of Eskom by involving independent power producers, set up the campaign against nuclear energy, and develop a position on transition to a socially owned renewable energy." And with that, I'd like to welcome Comrade Vavi.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting us in SAFTU, with delegation of 2 of us who are going to be participating in the course of all of the discussions we will have today and the next 2 days to 3. That have nothing to do with me. And we are coming from a country which you helped to liberate and give its freedom and democracy just 24 years ago. We're dealing with our own issues that are not linked to the issues we're going to be speaking about throughout the course of today. We are emerging from a 400 years of colonialism, and when we speak colonialism, we know we're speaking about globalization, we're speaking about capitalism, we're speaking about oppression and the denial of basic human rights of the humankind. We're emerging from 40 years of apartheid system. We're dealing with issues that have to do with everything that I've already mentioned. We normally say it's all of the above. All of the above in that we must recognize the interconnectedness between why the superior powers in the form of the United Kingdom found reason to invade our land and take it over, and the reasons being part of its expansionary drive to make sure that it spread its influence all over the world. Something that we're dealing with its consequences today as we engage with the issues of climate change, the issues of democracy, and the issues of a growing crisis of unemployment, poverty, and inequalities. And today I don't want to bore you with all of the details of the extent of that crisis in South Africa. I assume that you have a good idea of the extent of that crisis, and except to summarize it as follows: the crisis of unemployment in South Africa is only seen in the context of the various ILO reports that say that our unemployment rate is sitting at 6 in the entire world, or the 6th largest in the entire world. We've become the most unequal society in the world, and we're living in a country where 55% of its population is trapped in degrading poverty. So it's important that we must situate that the discussion about just transition in the realities of South Africa. The second point that I think we're going to have to speak about is that colonialization of the country have always been based on the drive by the greater superpowers, Britain and others, to extract the mineral resources of the country in order to build industrial base in their own countries. So we're living in a country that has been dominated economically by an extraction program, an extraction regime led by the multinational corporations that come from Britain and later from all over the world. And this is where we come from. And this is the centrality of the point that I want to make today. We're dealing with one issue. And any attempt to try and find a difference between the total overall crisis of what humankind is facing today will always be proven to be shallow and misinformed. We are dealing with the crisis of a capitalist system. A capitalist system that is based on extraction, that is based on taking advantage of everything under the sun for the benefit of a very few that controls the means of production, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. And that system is not dying as we speak, despite its many, many crises that we have seen in the recent past. The biggest of it being the crisis we saw in 2008 and 2009 in the United States of America, which then spread all over the world, including South Africa. This makes me to remember some fellow who once in prison wrote something that reads as follows, that the crisis consists of precisely the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I think that one of the symptoms that have appeared is the crisis of global warming, is the crisis of climate change, is the crisis of the consequences of all of those phenomena, which includes deepening levels of poverty, deepening levels of inequalities, deepening levels of unemployment, and as well as, of course, the direct consequences of global warming on the Mother Earth. I'm coming from a country which is now beginning to, in a very real way, receive or get the impact of this crisis that is developing around the world. You know, many of you who have visited South Africa, there is a very, what we call a prime tourist attraction city in the form of Cape Town, which have seen the longest recorded period of drought, which have led to serious crisis of water shortages, to the point that families now cutting across the usual divide of white and black or rich and poor have been forced to face drying taps, really, and in a real way. Drying taps in that they have to go queue up for water that are supplied by the municipalities. And the consequence of that is that we're facing a possibility that 500,000 jobs may be lost in the whole of the Western Cape, primarily in the agricultural sector, which is forcing then hundreds and thousands of former farm workers and villagers to migrate into the cities, compounding the problems of housing, of infrastructure, including of crime in those cities that are beginning to be crammed now as a result of that mass movement of people away from the rural side. In the east of the country, some of you may have been in Durban, we're beginning to see the evidence of unending floods, unpredictable weather that is driving people off their land, creating a crisis of food insecurity amongst hundreds and thousands of people as they see their animals' life unsustainable and their overall lives just completely unsustainable. This is adding to a crisis that, as I was saying, already exists in the country, and a crisis of underdevelopment for the majority. And that's why you can never talk about a just transition without talking about its twin brother and twin sister, and that is development and democracy. Development in the sense that in our country, if I was to be seen marching in the streets, making a demand that South Africa must make a quick exit from a carbon-dominated economy, as we do have in larger parts of the country, such as in the provinces that are mining coal, I will be laughed at by ordinary people. They will say that something has gone wrong with me because I cannot speak about a just transition in their context without pointing out exactly where alternative jobs will be found for them. That's the first point. So that's why we insist that a just transition discussion can't be separated from a discussion about development and about jobs and about addressing the levels of inequality, food insecurity, and poverty, hunger of the millions of people of the world today. I would be laughed at as a madman if I was to join the fundamentalists who at times have demanded that there are actually more rights for butterflies and animals than there are for ordinary workers and the poor in the country. There has to be a direct discussion about what each concept means in the context of the various challenges facing our people. The first introduction of what I've said makes a fundamental statement that unless we all unite and take drastic action to ensure that we stop any further deterioration of the current crisis of global warming and of all of the things associated with it, we will all perish. Whether you are employed or unemployed, we will just die one by one. And so any trade union movement that can advocate that we should do nothing and we should just continue to just mount slogans, we knows that it is acting very irresponsibly. The reality is that we must engage with the reality, the greatest reality of our time, and that is that global warming is no longer something that we were articulating and intellectualizing about in 1998. This is 2018. The realities are now beginning to be things that we're going through and survive from in our daily lives. So we must take action, absolutely take action. But we must take action equally against underdevelopment. And we must take action against the growing inequalities between countries of the world and within each and every country. Because I think that's the twin challenge that we're facing at this particular moment. And that's why we are so excited to come and be part of this conference to talk about a just transition. As part of your introduction, you spoke about the challenge that we are facing at this moment in our country, which we will speak about more in detail sometime tomorrow. Those of you who will be part of us here. The country, under the leadership of a president who is a former trade union, not just a trade unionist, one of the most celebrated trade unionists of the 1980s, who crossed the glass floor to become a multi-billionaire, and who is currently driving a project to emasculate the working class that gave birth to him because of the new friends that he now keeps, have introduced under a pretext that South Africa must move away from a carbon-based economy into the so-called green economy, as they say, introduce a program to basically slowly, steadily, but surely hand over the energy production capacity of the country, take it away from the state and hand it over to the private companies through a program they called the Independent Power Producers. And they say South Africa cannot afford the current levels of carbon, which we all agree, indeed, we can't afford that. But at the same time, what we cannot afford is then a takeover of such an essential service that ought to be provided by ordinary people through their democratic state and hand it over to private hands for profit accumulation reasons. And he's doing that obviously ruthlessly and refusing to engage. And that's why we insist on a democratic transition, on the transitions that will take care of the needs of ordinary people, including their right to employment, to decent work, to decent living standards, but at the same time to a movement towards ensuring that their climate and their world, their earth, is protected from the rampages of the capitalist order that cares for nothing except the logic of profit accumulation. This project called PPPs, the Independent Power Producers, is going to eventually hand over, as I was saying, this very important resource of South Africa under the excuse that this we're doing for climate change reasons. We are resisting that, and we're going to be speaking more about why we're doing so in the sessions that we're going to have tomorrow. So in conclusion, we're making very clear demands of what we think must happen as part of managing this transition. And I'm going to quote the organization that we all came from, called COSATU, before it was captured by the agenda of the few to the destruction of the common interest of everybody that we should serve as ordinary people. The trade union movement capacity to obviously engage with the very complex issue must improve. If the trade union movement doesn't have the capacity to engage with this will continue to be a discussion of the experts in small boardrooms, which will fly way above the heads of ordinary workers. And yet the challenge we're facing is that these issues, these demands for just transition, mustn't be just demands of people in the boardrooms, but must be demands of ordinary people who have been conscientized, who have been politicized, and who can make a link between their living reality and the need to live under decent conditions at this moment and as well as in future. The issue of, therefore, the capacity to research, the capacity to educate is part and parcel of the demands that we should be making on a just transition. We must begin to obviously look at this issue very sectorally. Mining industry, for example, in South Africa have particular history, has particular impact. If you come to South Africa one day, I'll take you to a province in Mpumalanga where people are being displaced from their land as we speak in order to give space for more mining activities that are bound to produce more carbon in that economy and exacerbate the overall crisis that we are facing in the economy. The steel industry have its own peculiar circumstances. It's also, if it is not managed properly, can play a huge role in exacerbating the crisis of climate change, precisely because of the releases that of the extent of which it can jeopardize the situation of climate change as we speak. Someone else can say we've got to relate to the issues of tourism, of health sector, of education in the context of all of the issues that we speak about in the transition. I'm hope that I'm still within my 15 minutes.
I don't know. Oh, that's my job.
I must be disciplined still and not go beyond and not go beyond that. The comprehensive social securities for ordinary people and the need to be real when we speak about a move from a carbon and into a just world, as I will call it. The management of that in the context of development, in the context of ensuring that jobs are created in the real terms and that technologies help us create alternative jobs to the jobs that we blame now for increasing emissions in the world, is something that I think the trade union movement ought to engage with. But let me end with this point. A trade union movement that engages on this issue on its own without ensuring that it embraces all of the civil society formations, not only those that are engaged in the climate justice discussion or in the debate about the just transition or climate, but the entirety of the civil society, so that all of the central demands can be demands of all of the working class, of all of the civil society formations. If a trade union movement is going to continue to just work on its own, based on its previous power, with all of the crises that we've spoken about already in the transition, about how the social democracies in Europe, for example, have seen more and more workers leaving the trade union membership, and because they see no real difference between being a trade union member or being non-trade union member. If we do not realize the limitations of the today's social dialogue, that we can think that we can, through some arrangement with the employers of give and take, and think that that on its own can produce the result, then it will mean that we are not learning from the recent lessons of today. The issue of demanding a just transition is an issue of social power. It's an issue of organizing. It's an issue of building organization and building a base of workers who are well prepared to be marching, holding hand to hand with the rest of other formations of civil society elsewhere to demand that we must move away from the point that I started with. We are dealing with a capitalist crisis that is reproducing itself in so many different ways. And only the conscious ones can match that and can confront that head on. And I think this conference is about the beginnings of building that social power of the trade union movement and of civil society, so that it can combine into a single force to oppose the destruction not only of our workplaces, but the destruction of the entire world. Thank you very much.
Us very far along the road towards one of the central concerns of the conference, which is beginning to really define the meaning of just transition, particularly in light of the global south, sky-high levels of unemployment and natural disaster simultaneously, and energy poverty. And so I want to thank you for that, and I assume that Joshua will take us a little further along that road. Joshua is the Secretary General of Centro, a federation of unions representing 80,000 members in the private, public, and informal sectors, including migrant workers, women, and youth in the Philippines. And Centro is a member of TUED, and Joshua, a very active participant in TUED. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm not used to speaking while sitting down, so because I can't see the people at the back. Listening to my colleagues in front, I guess you now know that this is a conference for the next 1 month. So I hope you're prepared to have that discussion, because it is true. I mean, listening to all the issues that were raised, it really gives us a picture of how daunting the challenges are for us. So let me add to that, to those daunting challenges. We've heard about the enormous impact of climate change. And Natasha, thank you for taking us along those discussions. And we've heard about the challenges about dealing with the crisis of capitalism. So thank you, Comrade Vavi, for doing that for us. But hand in hand with all these problems, we should not forget that while we are dealing with climate change and while we are dealing with all the problems that we've already listened to, we are also dealing with a situation where politically the right is on the rise. I mean, yes, there is a crisis in capitalism. And normally, ideally, theoretically, as part of the left, we should say that, well, this is our moment, right? But it's not. Unfortunately, it is the other side that's taking the situation, that's maximizing the situation rather than us. It's the right wing who are gaining power rather than us. And that actually exacerbates the problems we are facing. Because now, rather than deal head-on with the problems as science has pointed out to do, many of those in power are denialists, and they're starting now to use the powers of the state to actually, turn us back away from the real solutions that we need in order to address all these problems. So that's one thing that I'd like to add in the global context. So that gives us another week of discussion. And then second, in particular, because of the rise of the right wing, at least in our part of the world, we also have to deal with a problem that nobody actually speaks about. And this is the problem of the rise of militarism. There's a massive arms buildup in many countries in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, in response to the kind of geopolitical games that China and the US and Japan and other world dominators are trying to play. And all this arms buildup is actually siphoning off much needed resources for welfare into a very unproductive sector of our economy, and that's the arms, and that's the security industry in the world. And that's a problem that nobody actually talks about, even in my part of the world. And that's sad, because I think all these issues, climate, the issue, and you pointed it out, the issues about democracy, our struggle for democracy, and now the struggle for peace, these are all interlinked. And whether we like it or not, we, as workers, would always be affected by all of this directly and indirectly. Now, if we are in the labor movement, if we are the first line and last line of defense of the working class, then we should be dealing with all these issues. And it is a daunting challenge. And to do that, my colleagues here in front have already pointed it out. In order to do that, we need to take on all these challenges all together. In order to take on climate, we have to deal with the fact that we need to talk about the whole system. We need to change the system rather than the climate in itself. That's already been mentioned earlier. And in order to take on the transformation of the system, the whole campaign for energy democracy takes a central place, particularly for unions. Because I do not think that people, particularly in the South, who are struggling with the kind of day-to-day issues of poverty, of having the jobs or having the food to eat, or having the house, having a roof to sleep on, these day-to-day basic issues that many of our workers in the South, in the global South, are facing, I don't think we can mobilize them unless we actually link their day-to-day issues with the kind of issues that we're facing. There's no way to do that. I'm from the Philippines, and we are at the forefront of all these climate change typhoons that you have been experiencing also in the US. But I have mentioned this again and again. Climate would be an issue for many of Filipinos only for the first week after we have been devastated by a typhoon. After that, we're back to day-to-day issues of where do we get jobs, where do we get food, how do we eat, where do we sleep, stuff like this. So there's no way we can actually mobilize the working class unless we can link their day-to-day issues with the issues of transformative campaigns that we're trying to think of in terms of addressing climate. And I think energy democracy is so important for that. And that brings me to my third point. If we're talking about the crisis of capitalism, I think there's also a bigger crisis that we have to face, and that's the crisis of the left. That, to me, is the bigger problem. I've been a socialist all my life. Don't ask me what kind of a socialist, so let's not get into that. Let's not get into that at this point. But my point is this. I've always believed that socialism has always had the better alternative than capitalism. I still believe that that is so. That a more socialized form of economic development is a better future for everyone. But our problem has always been our inability to transform our vision into practical, political, pragmatic, political programs. And that is the reason why, rather than us in the left being in power, it's now the right taking over power. Precisely because it's hard for us, to convince people how do we actually actualize the visions that we've had. And that is becoming much, much harder every day if we keep on allowing the powers that be to continue constructing an architecture of impunity around the world, where they lock in, where corporations through the states are able to lock in the powers of, to lock in the rights of corporations rather than the rights of workers and people, for example, where because of free trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, and all these global agreements are locking in the powers of corporations and even the state, which makes it difficult for us to actually struggle for social transformation. And that brings me to my last point. And if you haven't read it, this is the topic for the day. This is I think I would say, and they didn't pay me to say this, I would say that this is probably the best article I've ever read about just transition. And I think every trade union activist in the world should read this. And why am I saying that? As I said, they didn't pay me to say this. And why am I saying this? Because it points us to the right direction. It points us it forces us to reflect what exactly it is that we have to do as a global movement. And that to me is where that to me is where the crisis of the left is actually much more apparent for trade unionists. Because we know that we are all part of the world's biggest movement, right? I mean, the labor movement is still the biggest movement in the world at this point in time. My problem is its size does not reflect the actual power that it wields. Now, as a comrade from Latin America would love to say, whenever there's a COP meeting, the ITUC, which represents the global labor movement, has the same power as the NGOs that are sitting with them, which have very, very less members rather than compared to the labor movement. And why is that? Because I think, and this is where the paper is important for me, because I think fundamentally we have yet to reimagine our role in a situation. I think the labor movement has yet to reimagine its role away from the social dialogue that it got so used to dealing with. let's not forget, words like social dialogue, social partnership. Well, these are actually language to hide the realities of class war and to hide the realities of class struggle. These were designed specifically to avoid the realities of the world that we have to face. And the paper actually now starts pointing us that we have to start developing the kind of power that we really have, but we haven't been using for many, many years. And Comrade Ravi has pointed us to that. Now, we need to mobilize our membership, but therein lies the problem to me. For example, last year, during the COP in Berlin, the TUED and had a very, very important strategy session with the ITUC. And it was a really good, it was a ITUC strategy meeting where there are many people. It was really, really good discussion. And in fact, it was so good that the conference actually endorsed a proposition that came from the floor where we should have a global day of action before the next COP in order to start mobilizing our members and start using our social power and use it in order to augment our negotiators who are sitting in the discussions inside the COP. It was endorsed by all the conference participants. Unfortunately, in that same room, there were so few political decision makers from among the unions. That is the problem. Now, there were so few who were actually there are so few who would actually make a decision about whether that should be done or not. And to be honest, after that resolution has been passed last year, I have yet to hear from the ITUC leadership whether that would push through or not. That's the sad part. That's a really, really sad part. Because I think the reality is that we're still dealing with a movement that is largely dominated by the unions in the global north. And because it is dominated by the unions in the global north, they may be blinded by the realities of what are the true nature of the struggles that many, many workers like those in the global south actually face. So that's why I really think that everyone has to read this paper, because it really helped. I mean, I didn't know, when I read this, I didn't know that what we're doing is actually reflected here. It resonates, it speaks to me, because let me give you a concrete example before I end. One of the key struggles that we've had in the Philippines in the past 2 years is about the so-called modernization program of the government for the transportation sector. One of the major vehicle conveyance, form of conveyance for working class, for workers, would be what we call the jeepneys. These are really cute but outdated type of vehicles that we invented, we redeveloped from the jeeps that were left behind by the GIs during World War II. We converted them into passenger jeepneys. Anyway, my point is this: we have about 200,000 jeepneys that employs about 500,000 workers, if you like. Now the government is hell-bent on phasing all of them out, because the main argument is that it is really causing so much pollution, which is true, because it's using second-hand diesel engines coming from Japan that have already been used in Japan for 10 years and then sold to the Philippines to be used again for another 10 years. And so these are really old engines that are really polluted. The problem is they wanted to phase out the jeepneys without any clear alternatives, as you were saying, without any clear alternatives to the workers. So our members in the transport industry went on strike twice last year, just to force the government to sit down and talk about just transition. But here's our problem. We've always thought of just transition as something that is akin to climate jobs, where you actually generate jobs while contributing to the lessening of carbon emission of the economy. That was our thinking originally. But then when we were discussing and having a dialogue and having a struggle with the government, we realized that, hang on, there's no way we will lessen emission even if the government, even if we force the government to help us transition to new vehicles, but still we're still using vehicles that are using fossil fuel, because technology for electricity, electric cars are not yet there and enough to be practical for the transport workers. Then what are we talking about? We're not talking about transitioning to a lower economy, to a lower carbon economy. We are only transitioning in the sense that we're saving jobs of our members. Now, is that bad? No, of course not. That's very important from a trade union perspective. But therein lies the dilemma, I think, and the problem, I think, that we need to grapple with. When we talk about just transition, we must be very clear. It is not about just about saving our jobs. It also has to be about addressing the transformative politics that we need in order to change the system rather than the climate. And that, to me, is the key question. How do we do that? Unfortunately, I have no answer, and I hope in the next month, after discussing at the end of after 1 month of discussion, we probably should have. Thank you.
Okay, it's time now to open the floor to maybe some people have got some answers, or at very least some more questions. So I think we have, what, 10 or 15 minutes? Okay. We're open for questions. In the back of the room. Yeah.
Morning. Of America. And my questions for Vavi. I want to hear more about the mobilization around the just transition in South Africa, because this seems like a real thing happens in the South, global South country. And they talk about just transition and mobilization. It's excellent. So I want to hear more.
I'll be lying to you if I was to tell you that we've just had a strike to demand just transition. There's been no such a strike. Outside us mobilizing around COP17, which was a great moment of mass education of our members in relation to the issues of climate change, there has been no direct actions on the part of workers to resist that in a manner that we hope we will be able to do in the future. There's lots of fights that are localized in the country. For example, workers in the Vaal Triangle area are in a very strong partnership with the civil society formations fighting against emissions that have completely spoiled their environment and have created all manner of complications such as breathing problems and many other diseases. Workers in south of Durban have fought Shell company there over many years, over the extent to which it is messing up the environment, leading to all manner of diseases to impact on the societies that reside around that area. Workers in the Western Cape are in partnership with all manner of civil society formations to look at the alternatives to the current farming methods that rely on certain weather patterns and the usage of water that is becoming to be such a scarce issue there. And so there's all manner of localized battles. I'm coming to this conference at the time when in our recent meeting of the National Executive Committee, we've taken a decision to convene what we call a working class summit. A working class summit of all formations that call themselves the left. Maybe you must come to South Africa. I don't know whether we will find a solution, but we will be in a conference to look at all of these issues, how they linked to one another. Issues of climate, issues of job losses, issues of people being moved out of their land, issues of land poverty, issues of homelessness and lack of infrastructure, issues of hunger and food insecurity. As I was saying, all of these issues must be grouped into a single struggle of the working class. And I think the days of workers in the trade unions fighting their own battles around just transition will make no sense in the context of the reality of what we are dealing with in the world, which is a crisis of capitalism that keeps on reproducing itself in all different kinds. We thought that 2008 these guys were dying. They are not dying. They've just found a way of re-emerging even much more stronger than they were in 2008. Here in America, you are dealing with Trump that you didn't have to deal with before 2008. I think somehow is the consequences of the regrouping capitalist system and finding much more hard-nosed, mad people to champion their cause. And all over Europe, there is a rise of fundamentalists, and there's a rise of fascism, there's a rise of racism. In South Africa too, we're facing the same type of challenges. So let me end the point in answering your question. We are only moving towards that direction of regrouping all of these struggles into one working class struggle to respond to the crisis at hand.
By your presentations, it is very much rehearsing all of the works to see that
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah?
Please
sorry.
Yeah.
I am Chennaiya from India. I work among fish workers and agriculture workers as a trade union federation. Really very good, very provocative presentations in that sense on the issues of climate justice issues. So we also need to see in that context, I don't know whether it is question or just complimentary what made presentation. There is a north within the south, and there is south within the north. So those issues also need to be seen by the trade unions very clearly. Otherwise, we will be bulldozed by only those two blocks, and then we'll be trapped by the capitalist force saying that. Second one is the development notions that has been infiltrated in the minds of the people in South, that development means displacement. Development means create unemployment. Development means crisis of the natural resources. So we have to see that how do we really, those kind of things has to be seen. Then confrontation of the contradictions. Within the South, we have to see formal, informal. And how do we bring those kind of things to really to address the issues of the structural changes that Joshua has really very clearly now put down the points, which is not the short term, it has to be a long term. How do we address those things, addressing these issues also, taking strengths from both ends, north and south.
Would one of you like to respond to any part of this? The north within the south, south within the north, and formal and informal contradictions.
Well, thank you, Senator Chennaiya, for pointing that out, because that is a reality. I don't think it's a reality only in the South. I think it's a reality even in the global North. And Humberto is nodding his head. Maybe Humberto can add to that later. Yes, I agree. Those are problems. But in our part, one of the things that we're trying to do is to promote this whole notion of social movement unionism, where we try to dismantle the borders and the barriers between formal and informal sector by first making sure that everyone agrees that, well, if we are all part of the working class, then we should be part of the same movement. And at the same time, social movement unionism also says, for us, also means what you just said, that trade unions cannot continue fighting for social justice and social transformation all by itself. It has to do so together with the other social movements working in our societies. So to me, that's not a complete solution, but that is a way for trade unions to get out of its straitjacket of view that, like for example, before in the Philippines, when you talk about trade unions, you're only talking about workers, a small section of the working class that are formally employed and are regular workers. Today, these are no longer the typical workers. These are the atypical workers, because the typical workers in my country are the non-regular workers, those in the informal sector, and those that are not really part of the labor movement. So we do need to break out of our comfort zones, if you like.
I had somebody back here for a long time, and then Judy, and then we'll come forward.
Thank you. Good morning, sisters and brothers. I'm Umberto Bandiera from Switzerland. I work for Union, the main union in Switzerland. My question is about to everybody, in effect. I come back to the last thing that Joshua said. How do we do it? And I looking to that woman that is close to you, Rosa Luxemburg, that look to everybody in this moment, and a proposal is to come back to our roots and to try to take in consideration what is previewed in the last paper of Sean and the social power, and to give it the real name, that is revolution, and not to be scared to use it, actually, in this moment, to start to take action. And so my question is, as we can back to the roots and imagine that the mass strike that Rosa Luxemburg has very clearly described it in that period, it could be used again actually to permit to the unions to be the lead of the social movements everywhere, to attack the capitalism, everywhere, and to propose a new social model for the future. Thank you.
We'll take some more questions. Judy next, and then up here.
Okay. Judy Gonzalez from New York State Nurse Association. I was just wondering, when we talk about, for example, people who work in coal mines who lose their lifestyle is completely gone if the coal mines close, and we talk about just transition, do any of the unions have a programmatic plan? Has that been laid out? Okay, 100,000 people work in this coal mine. We're still producing coal for energy, but in the meantime, we're doing this. This is how we see the training going on. This is how we see the transition going. It would take this many years. This is how we see where the unions would be. This is how we see where the government would be. Because what I find is it's a nice idea, and people say it's a nice idea, but they want to know, what's the programmatic plan? What does that look like in terms of years, in terms of process? Has that been explored to explain to people, how this is actually possible? Even though we know that we're limited by the nature of our society, we can still put forward a vision. I just wondered if that's been explored or explained or discussed.
That sounds like a question for you, but let's get, and then the brother here in front from the transit workers. Go ahead. We'll take one more question and then we'll.
Hello, everyone. JP Patafio, Transport Workers Union, New York City. So this idea of like a transition, obviously trade unions are limited politically, right? If you're really talking about a left, you have to kind of, in some ways, envision something beyond a trade union to get there, a political party, per se. Also, maybe a new type of formation. Is there any conversation about co-ops? That cooperatives, workers cooperatives, as a means of trying to take ownership of an industry, and then since you take an ownership of that industry, you have to really grapple with the issues of what that means, right? Profitability, health, disbursement of, equitable disbursement of those resources, so on and so forth, and also the issues of safety and health. I find that a lot of workers don't connect to there's travesties of typhoons and hurricanes, but they do connect to, you're going to get lung cancer from diesel fumes, and therefore we have to start a campaign to phase out diesel engines. I mean, it's low-hanging fruit, and it doesn't seem like it always connects to the bigger issue of tackling, these great climate tragedies that are falling upon us. But I think there's a role to play in that, and I was just wondering if it works where you're at.
Joshua, do you want to? Let's go with those because you won't remember all.
You want to respond? The coal first?
No, I wanted to just make a few comments about the. I wanted to make few comments about these challenges, these contradictions, and these seemingly tensions if they are not confronted openly. The realities, for example, that workers in the South who are living in underdeveloped countries will always face a little bit of different realities to workers of the North and therefore developed nations, and therefore the priorities will at times not be the same unless these conferences of this kind to talk about issues openly. For example, the whole issues of trade, the trade negotiations, even the climate change in the context of West Europe and countries like Africa. You sometimes you're talking about different issues precisely because of those inherent differences that exist. But I think that the point is not just to end there. There's also contradictions even in the South, because there are different levels of development there. Some countries in the South, for example, such as South Africa, are at times accused of playing a role of being the superpower in the same way that America is accused of being a superpower, and sometimes get accused of being the imperialists, and sometimes get accused of being the source of casualization and the destruction of a decent work agenda because of the roles multinational corporations coming from South Africa play up north in the continent. There will always be contradictions. But the working class do not get swayed with the contradictions of that kind. The working class that identify the centrality of its problems. And the centrality of the problems of the working class is that it is being exploited, whether they are in Europe or in America or in North West or East or Asia or Africa, it doesn't matter where. The enemy is one, is the multinational corporations that are moving all over the world in search of more possibilities to maximize their profits at the expense of exploiting workers, irrespective of where those workers are, or irrespective of their gender or their religion or their race, irrespective of all of the usual divisions that keep people apart. And that's why conferences like this play such a central role in conscientizing ourselves that actually we belong to but just one class. We may be experiencing different kinds or lesser kinds of exploitation, but it is still exploitation. Whether it is being done in where or in which part of the world is still exploitation. I felt that I must just say that in passing in relation to that question of the different, should I call them, the tensions, the dialectics that are always within one struggle. Now, the two other questions asked by my comrade from Switzerland and the others are actually the same question in my view, and it relates to the point that you were making, Josh, about the state of the left and whether the left does take the advantage of the crisis of the other side. The other side have gone through hell of crisis. 2008 being the worst crisis of many, many decades. In fact, the worst crisis since 1928. But have the left taken any advantage? I don't think so. I think I agree with you on that point wholeheartedly. And the reason why we are not taking advantage of the crisis of capitalism is because when we are required to think alternatives, we resort into sloganizing. We analyze, we sloganize, and we produce papers about the cycle of a crisis repeating itself over and over, but we never ever find time, the 1 month that you are demanding, to sit down and say, what do we mean when we say just transition? Write it on the board. And when we say there are alternatives to a carbon economy or carbon-based economy, such as in South Africa. In South Africa, I'm told we are the fourth coal-based country in the world. It's loads and loads of it. The entirety of the energy that is being produced now and that will be produced in the future in terms of the poor big power generations plants that are being built will be powered by coal, meaning that we're not dealing with a passing problem and we're worsening the crisis of climate change, and yet the left is not anywhere to say we can move out of this in this way. Not in the manner that is going to give another new life to the very same system of capitalism that we complain exploit us, but in a transformative and in a revolutionary way. And in my view, and I know that we may not agree with this, revolution means socialism. But socialism must be defined in terms of what we mean in the context of the challenge that we are faced today. Socialism can't just be another resorting to a slogan. Socialism must mean that we must defeat this agenda which just deepen the crisis of humankind and replace it with a more humane system. And that humane system will mean that these are the new ways of producing energy. And that's where we are found wanting as the left. These are new ways of moving us from carbon to a just system of producing emissions. There will always be emissions, by the way. The question is, how do we control it, and how do we take charge of the production methods that take care of human needs above the interest of the few for profiteering and for getting rich quickly and quickly. Okay. And I felt that those questions were quite related.
But there's a question about closure of coal mines. Is there a program for just transition?
Exactly, that's the point, that there isn't.
Right.
There isn't. Yeah. The government says, look, we are committed to Paris, we are committed to COP17. We even hosted one conference in 2011, I think it was. We're marching from South Africa to Brazil, and we are marching further. There's no shortage of words about what must be written. You remember, the books, the paper never protest about what is written on it. The paper accepts anything written on it. I think we're finding ourselves exactly in that crisis now.
Okay. So, I wonder, Natasha or Joshua, if you want to say final words as we close.
Yeah, just a quick comment about the trade unions and your question, comrade. As I said, I don't have answers, but we do have some ideas. The first idea is that we think and this is one of the things that we've learned a few years back, the historical division that social democrats have between the trade unions and the political party, for example, where the trade unions would take care of its members while the political party takes care of the political representation of the working class. I think that has to be questioned now. It has failed, and it continues to fail. Am I saying that trade unions now should act like a political party? No. I'm just saying that I think the trade unions should not limit itself to the bread and butter issues of the working class, but rather it should start acting what it should really be, and that is a political actor. I mean, we don't need the mediation of political parties for us to say what it is exactly do we want. And I think it's about time that if the political parties start saying things that we do not want, that we should be able to break with them and openly tell them that they are wrong and they should not be voted by the working class if that's the case. And to me, that's what it means when I say that I actually don't believe that trade unions should be limited. In fact, I think trade unions should start going beyond its limits.
Natasha, would you have a
Not really. I think that was this should be the focus of the discussions, and I'm here to mostly talk about the science. A couple of things that I wanted to mention are that in my experience talking to people, different audiences about climate change issues, it's always more important to connect to people with their local problems, explain how climate change is going to affect their everyday life. That's what counts for them. And that is one end. Trade unions are best positioned to do something like that. And I mean, along with other partners, but certainly trade unions, putting together, even if it is not a definitive plan of transition, something should be put out for deliberations, for people to think about, to start understanding that we are needing something much more than the old examples of green jobs, of market solutions, of things like that. This needs to be put as such out. And the final thing that I wanted to stress out, and probably Sean Sweeney has highlighted that in the past, trade unions need to become more important partners in the IPCC discussion. NGOs, and you mentioned it as well, NGOs they have a great role, and I don't see why trade unions are not becoming more vocal and more participating and in the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. 5 minutes. Thank you, everyone. We're going to take a 5-minute break before the next panel.